the UK Psych Health and Safety and ISO 45003 podcast.
Welcome to the latest episode of the UK Psych Health and Safety podcast. My name is Sheila Lord, and today I am joined by a new co-host who's filling in for Peter this week, and that is Jason Van Schie from Flourish DX, all the way in Perth, Australia. Welcome, Jason.
Thanks for having me, Sheila. It is good to be on the second best psych health and safety podcast on the internet.
Fantastic. And joining us today is Kate Field from BSI. Kate is the Global Head of Health, Safety and Wellbeing at British Standards Institution. And Kate is from a health and safety background with over 2 decades, although she doesn't look it, experience in her field. So we're going to be talking to Kate today primarily about the 45003 standard and looking at kind of since its launch, how this has been received across industry. So we're seeing a lot of interest. I know Jason certainly is. I know we at BMR are seeing a lot of interest in the standard, and not just for those accredited to 45001, just generally on a really wide scope. So Kate, I'm going to hand over to you. This is something obviously that you've been involved in for quite some time now. So give us the background around the standard and why it was developed, and how it's structured within, for the listeners that don't really know, how it's structured and why it's structured the way it is within 45001.
Lovely. Thank you, Sheila, and nice to meet you as well, Jason. And thank you for inviting me. It's great to be able to talk about this exciting new international standard. So why has it been developed? The international committee who developed 45001, and for those of you who don't know the numbers and the terminology, I'll try and catch myself, and I apologize if I don't and I miss it. So ISO 45001 is the first international standard on occupational health and safety management. So standards are, in simple terms, they're how-to documents, how to implement and use a health and safety management system or any other subject that standards are written about, and they're developed by a group of international experts coming together from around the world, bringing all their expertise, all their insights, all the best practice into one place and agreeing what a single document and source toolkit will look like. So that's kind of the context of standards. And 45001, so this occupational health and safety management standard, was developed and published 3 years ago now, actually coming up to 3.5 years ago, in 2018. And it was based on actually a British standard that BSI wrote, and 18001, but it was developed into a fully fledged international standard. And within that standard, it talks about the management of health and safety hazards and risks. And that includes health and safety. And as we know, and this is true around the world, you know, health has always been the forgotten element of health and safety, although is generally at the front. There's always been a focus on safety and not on health. Aspects of that are improving, particularly sort of for more physical health issues, so occupational cancers, occupational asthmas, occupational dermatitis. But there's a forgotten part of health, and that's psychological health and safety. And although that international standard does reference and draw attention to some forms of psychological health and safety hazard and risk, there was a recognition by the International Committee that it's the one area of health and safety that is less known, and organisations need much more help and support to understand what to do and how to do it. And that's because there's a lot of myths and misconceptions about psychological health and safety, a lot of fear that, because it's potentially dealing with mental illness, that people have a lot of stigma associated with that, a lot of nervousness about having the competency or saying the wrong thing. And therefore, the International Committee decided to write 45003, ISO 45003, as an additional guideline document to really help and support organisations understand and tackle this issue in a really robust way. So again, it's a how-to guide for identifying these hazards that arise from work that can cause psychological ill health, and then a how-to guide about what to do about it. So it's a really great standard, and it is designed to work with 45001 because it's about health and safety management. So they're designed to complement and support each other, but you don't have to be using the first one, 45001, to use 45003. You can use it as a standalone. And then just the other point of your question, Sheila, kind of the way that they're structured. So ISO, the International Standards Organization, for all international standards, to help organizations to provide consistency and to help organize integrate standards, they set a specific structure that has to be followed, and it's to do with the kind of how you structure it in terms of setting the context, what leadership have to do, how you plan it, then how you implement it, and then how you check it. They use a plan, do, check, act approach, and that structure is set. So all international standards follow that same structure, and 45001 follows it. And then because 45003 is designed to complement 45001, you'll see that they're basically very similar structure, but there are a couple of additions which I'm sure we'll come on to for 45003.
Okay, fantastic. And you talk about obviously 45001 and 45003. So 45003 is a child standard, isn't it, of the 45001? So it sits alongside it. So it's structured in exactly the same way. When we're looking at adoption of this, just to put it into context, on a global scale, how many companies are currently certified to 45001?
So that's actually a question I can't answer, because it's very interesting. So obviously the International Standards Organization and the there's like a governing body for certification bodies. So BSI is a certification body, so we offer certification. They do a survey every 3 years generally, and go out and try and get a global picture of exactly how many certifications there are. And because 45001 is a brand new standard, it's only 3 years old, that survey hasn't been done yet, so I can't answer it as a specific number. What I can tell you that it is one of our biggest selling standards, and actually we have thousands of clients globally who have already certified to 45001, and we also know that is a growing trend. So it is easily on a par. There are 4 big standards that are used internationally, kind of the big ones. So not unsurprisingly, because it was kind of the first one, is quality management, which is 9001 for people who want the numbers. Then 14001 on environmental came through. And then we had information security. So if I get my numbers right, 27001. And then we've had 45001 come along. And actually we are seeing the interest in 45001 overtaking now 14 and also information security. So it is huge. So, thousands of organizations of all sizes, all sectors are using it because they recognize it's this global good practice tool about occupational health and safety management.
Fantastic.
Yeah, really interesting, Kate. We're a big believer of the value of standards ourselves. We have been certified to 27001 because we are an information technology company, and so we need to make sure that we are keeping client data secure. And that really is kind of what made our ears prick up, if you like, when we heard about the development of 45003 some time ago. In Australia, obviously, compared to the rest of the world, health and safety is pretty paramount. We have a very mature health and safety industry over here, similar to the UK. And I really see that 45,003 does, close a big gap in the understanding of the uniqueness of psych hazards and how to manage them appropriately in the risk. But specifically, what do you think the benefits are for companies around the adoption of 45,003?
So I think, we've seen a number of benefits. I mean, so I suppose I have to be honest and say 45,003 is brand new. It was only published about a month ago. So although a number of organisations, got a copy of the draft and have started implementing it as a draft and now are reviewing it and implementing it as a full published standard, we're still early on in terms of that process. But we know from other research, we know from our data from clients that about the benefits they get from implementing health and safety management systems. And I think one of the things that we tend to do with health and safety is we focus on the negative. We focus on, well, it will stop you hurting people, it will stop injuries, it will stop absence rates. And it absolutely does. There's evidence that, if you are using global good practice, then of course you are going to get those improvements. But actually the biggest benefits come from other areas that are much more positive. So you see things like, if we're talking about maybe a manufacturing type situation or even services, you see an improvement in quality of delivery of the product and the service. And the reason for that, I always think of it as simple, but I realize I've been doing this for 20 years and I live it and breathe it every day. But if you just step back and think about it, if you work for an organization that looks after you and you feel looked after, you'll pay a little bit more attention. You'll go that extra mile to do a really good job. And that's what good health and safety, and particularly psychological health and safety, gives. So you get an improvement in quality or service delivery. You get an improvement in staff engagement. People like to be there. They want to be there. They want to help their organization grow and prosper. People will stay in your organization. I mean, if they're unhappy and they're not being looked after, they'll leave. So, you're keeping the best talent, which is a huge issue at the moment. It's all over the news in terms of the vacancies that organizations are facing and recruiting that talent. And of course, the positive side is if you're seen as a good organization that looks after your people, then you'll get that talent, which is, a real issue. It helps with complying with the law. A standard isn't a direct link to complying with the law, but because it helps you establish your processes for doing that, it helps where you need to comply with the law. And then you see, and this was really interesting, I think psychological health and safety, in terms of an issue for businesses is been around for a number of years now, but with the last 18 months of the COVID-19 pandemic, I think that has raised even further up the agenda. And one of the things that BSI does every year is we carry out a survey to look at organizational resilience. So, there's a structure, unsurprisingly, there's a standard on it. But there's a structure about what an organization needs to do to be resilient for the long term. So not be able to survive disruption like this, but also thrive for the long term. And we did the survey last year, obviously, in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the biggest result that came through from that survey was those organizations that had prioritized their people, had focused on helping and supporting their people during a really challenging time, were the most resilient. So they were not only able to weather the storm of the COVID-19 pandemic, and obviously this varies around the world, but for those organizations that are starting to come out of the other end into, if you like, calmer waters, they are in a much more robust place and doing in simple terms, much more successfully than other organizations. And I think this is often overlooked at, looking after your people is good for your business. It's simple, really.
Kate, but when I talk to companies, they say they've been doing workplace mental health really well for years. They have fruit bowls, they have yoga, they have corporate massage, they have free gym memberships. How is ISO 45003 any different to that?
Yeah, so yoga and yoga initiatives, they are the bane of my life. So look, I don't want to take away from that. There is a place for helping and supporting individuals to understand how to live a healthier life, both physically and mentally. That it's, again, all over the news. There's plenty of research that says that the more conscious and the more effort we take in looking after our own personal physical and mental health, the better that will be for us in the long term. But the key challenge with those initiatives is they are focused on the individual and they're not focused on the organisational causes. And I think this is why it's been such an issue for such a long time, is organisations have wanted to do the right thing. They've wanted to help and support their people, and they've put in these things, and you putting some EAP, some mental health first aiders, some resilience training. You got to love some resilience training. They all have a part to play, but they are not addressing the root cause of the problems in the organisation, and that's where the issues lie. I can't remember. I was listening to your earlier podcast. I can't remember how Peter said it about his fish ponds. That was right, which I really loved. So Peter Kelly on one of your earlier had said he'd had a fish pond and some fish had been dying, and he thought that just the fish weren't very resilient. They weren't coping with the environment very well, and he got an expert out and found out actually the filter in the pond was broken and that was killing the fish. It's a perfect analogy to actually what goes on within organizations. They have individuals who talk about maybe work-related stress, or they've got cases of burnout, or people going on absence because of work-related depression and anxiety, and they think it's the people that aren't resilient. They just can't cope with the environment, and actually it's a blocked filter that is poisoning the environment that the organization needs to deal with. And that's what 45,003 is about. It's about the organizational causes and therefore the organizational solutions to the problem, and not the individual. And that is the step change, and what's really exciting, because that's been the missing link, and why organizations, when they've implemented these initiatives, have seen maybe some short-term benefits because people feel a little bit looked after and they feel like it's positive, but it's never long term, it's never sustained, because they haven't been dealing with those organizational issues.
Yeah, I think you've hit on two issues that exist currently in workplace mental health. One is the focus on individuals and symptoms. The individual's the problem, not the work environment. So let's fix the individual, make them more resilient to adverse work conditions. And the second thing is, if we think about the demands and resource model, there's been a lot of focus on giving people more resources, as in individual coping resources, and not enough on reducing demands. And that's really the focus of 45,003, obviously, identifying the hazards and reducing the risk, eliminating first of all, and then reducing the risk to as low as reasonably practicable.
Yeah, I mean, the other way I explain it from a health and safety point of view, because again, it is a health and safety risk, although it's not necessarily understood, but I draw the linkage through to fire safety within an organization. So organizations, when they're looking at health and safety risks, need to identify what might cause a fire, how to manage it. They put in controls to manage the fire risk. So, fire extinguishers, fire alarm systems. They train up their people about what to do in case of a fire. They practice the drills. They are all organizational level controls. And that is going to protect and make the most difference to the most people. of course, particularly when we're talking about evacuation, there may be individuals that need a little bit of extra support during an evacuation, you know, either on a temporary basis because they've got a broken leg and they're on crutches, so they, you know, they need support while they're recovering, or they might have a longer term maybe mobility issue, so they might be in a wheelchair and therefore they need support again for evacuation. And that's the same when we're dealing with psychological health and safety. You know, we are looking at those organizational level controls which will protect and support the most people. But within that, there may be one or two individuals that need some additional support in the short term or maybe over the longer term because of temporary illness, both physical and mental. And they just need a little bit of extra support. But if you're not dealing with those, you know, those organizational level issues, then you're not going to be protecting the bulk of your workforce. And you also, you know, I think the other thing, and this is one of the challenges, is if you focus on those individual issues, you risk actually creating barriers and additional stigma rather than dealing with the high level issues and breaking down those barriers and the stigma that can be particularly associated with mental ill health.
Yeah, not to mention the inefficiency, right? Trying to, like, you know, hammer all of the nails.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, Kate, in terms of how the standard's been received, I know that you've been, you know, BSI have been doing a lot of webinars, you've been putting a lot of stuff out there, Jason. I know with the free ISO training, we've seen a lot of uptake in terms of interest. How are you finding that for existing users of 45,001, Kate, and the interest? I would say aimed really at from a senior level perspective, from business leaders. How are you seeing that interest? Because what I come across a lot is that people in middle management and lower down, the people that are in the workplace, are really keen, really keen. But yeah, I still, one of the frequent barriers that we come across is that senior leadership teams are just not interested. They still perceive it as as you said before, a person problem.
So I'll answer it in two parts. So overall, the level of interest has been phenomenal, which I'm just so excited about because, you know, it can make such a difference to so many organizations and then obviously cascade down to individuals. I mean, I am seeing the same level of interest in this standard as I saw 3.5 years ago when 45,001 was launched. So the global interest is phenomenal. And again, you know, just to reiterate the point that is interest from all sizes of organizations, from micro through to multinational, and across all sectors as well. You know, it is designed to be accessible for everyone, all organizations. So yeah, without a doubt, the interest is phenomenal. And to answer your question in terms of the sort of the middle management versus leadership piece, I think, you know, historically you're right. I call it a blind spot. There is something about health and safety that senior leaders just don't like engaging with. I've been doing this for 20 years and I haven't nailed down what or why that is, you know, because you can make the business case, you can show them the numbers, you can show them the benefits, you can scare them, you know, or if you don't do it, you'll go to jail. I've seen all of that tried with varying levels of success and overall just sort of limited, I think. And I think it's because they haven't made the connection to the people. And what has happened in the last 18 months in particular is that connection to the people has been made. You know, we've had that breakdown of hierarchical barriers. We have all been in the situation of dealing with COVID. You know, we have all had the same challenges. We have all suddenly been at home. Well, I mean, again, that's generalizing hugely, but you know, there's a lot of the working population who went from working in the office one day to working on at their kitchen table the next. And I'm back at my kitchen table because my internet died, so I've had to move today. You know, and senior leaders were in that position, and they had their kids come in because they were homeschooling. They had the cat jump up and show everybody their fluffy tail. and it's really broken down the barriers, and we suddenly we're all seeing that understanding that we're all human, we're all people, we all have the same hopes, dreams, emotions and challenges. And therefore we have seen this shift that leadership are now understanding the value of people, which is, I mean, for me it's crazy because they're people and why wouldn't you, but it's taken a global pandemic as a social experiment to really break down those barriers. And again, coming back to the organizational resilience index I mentioned, it's become clear that the organizations that have looked after their people have been the most successful. And now as we come out of the pandemic, and a lot of people have considered their lives, their working lives, what they want out of that, and they are asking much tougher questions about particularly their work life. And if they are not getting the best out of that, if they're not feeling looked after, if they're not feeling fulfilled, they're thinking, why? This is crazy. Why will I stay? I'll go to another organization that actually cares. And senior leaders are seeing that. They're seeing, if they've got it wrong, they're seeing huge tranches of their talent leave. And for organizations that are getting it right, they're seeing a huge income of talent because, it's a much more attractive place to work. And we're still seeing that wave, and we're still, particularly as different pandemic waves hit different parts of the world, we're seeing that. So I think it's really brought it to the forefront of leaders' minds in a way that just hasn't happened before, and therefore they are the ones asking the question about how do we ensure that we are looking after the psychological health and safety of our people in the short term, but also the medium and longer term.
Yeah, I think you're right. Sorry, go on, Jason.
Yeah, I was going to say it's a bit like a perfect storm though, right? So I definitely agree that the pandemic has highlighted the importance of people and how human everyone really is and all the rest. But at the same time, not only are employees voting with their feet for, when they're working for an employer who doesn't care about them, but shareholders are as well, which is bringing to the board's agenda the idea of sustainability and making sure that we socially look after the needs of our workers. There's been some very highly visible instances in the UK where companies haven't looked after their employees and what that's actually done in the marketplace for companies. In Australia, there's some things happening. So there's two things, right? There's the positive, let's create sustainable businesses, and that means looking after our people, not just the environment. But then also let's make sure that we reduce the reputational risk by not having a mentally healthy workplace as well.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, that has been an additional driving factor. And I think also, over the last couple of years, we've had some other things that have just raised the people agenda. So Me Too, Black Lives Matter have just, I think, galvanized that focus on people. But you're right, there is a big move to a focus from shareholders on, sometimes it's called ESG, so environmental social governance issues. So shareholder capitalism towards stakeholder capitalism, is that piece. And you're right, in a lot of industries now, where they've got shareholders are asking questions. It used to be, if they ask a question, it used to be just, what are you doing to protect the environment? What are you doing in terms of climate? But actually they are asking that people question now, without a doubt, Jason. That is an additional driver, particularly for the larger organizations.
Yeah, and not just for the organizations themselves, right, but also their supply chain as well. Who are their contractors? Had a really interesting conversation with someone who used to work for a social media giant, and they would outsource a lot of their content moderation to smaller companies. And so really they're actually pushing the Psych hazard to another organization. Yeah, so really interesting, right? So it's all well and good for, the Facebooks, Twitters, Googles of the world to have really good practices in place to support the well-being of their employees. But what about their contractors who they're pushing a lot of this high risk work down to when you think about Psych hazard exposure?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a whole separate podcast, isn't it, on content moderation? But
So
you're right.
we've already done it.
Oh, you ready,
So.
Daddy? I'll go and listen to that one. I hadn't dug that one out.
No, it's coming. It's coming in a few weeks. It's
Oh, okay.
it's coming.
No, I mean you're right, but actually this is one of the really interesting things with so 45,001 as the overarching health and safety management system, but then also it's reflected in 45,003. There's a specific aspect that talks about, if you contract or you outsource some of your activities, what's the health and safety implications of that? It is not acceptable to basically say, well, that's too difficult for us, we'll give it to somebody else and then we don't have to worry about it. I mean, that doesn't align with those social values, and quite often doesn't. A lot of these organizations will say, we value the community, we're about doing the best thing for everyone, and then as you say, Jason, they take these really nasty bits of their work and they go, well, we'll just give it to somebody else and then we don't have to think about it. Well, actually, both of these standards focus on that and say that is completely unacceptable. If you are genuinely committed to looking after people, you should be genuinely committed to looking after everybody in your supply chain, and simply pushing it out of your kind of eye line is not acceptable and is missing the point. And I think that's one of the additional benefits. And I think the other thing that's worth mentioning, and given your base of operations, Jason, in Australia, we're seeing a much more focus on increasing regulation and legislation associated with psychological health and safety. A lot has been there, or it's certainly been part of general health and safety, but it's been forgotten. But we are seeing a real move across a number of countries for strengthening legislation specifically related to psychological health and safety. And I think, because there's a recognition that organizations, again, sadly, haven't done this voluntarily and therefore need a bit of a stick to push them in the right direction.
Yeah, I think we've been trying the carrot for a long time, right? Trying to demonstrate ROI and, saying it's just good business, but, companies haven't changed their practices. So sometimes a bit of a stick is needed. But some of these discussions or the conversation we've been having kind of leads into my next question on the sustainability angle. Is Peter believes that this will never be certifiable, this standard. But for those companies that are trying to measure social impact, the S in ESG, and report on that to shareholders, surely having a certifiable standard in 45,003 would actually help them to demonstrate that they are committed to best practice. But I'm interested in, first of all, your opinion. Do you think this will ever be certifiable? I think I know what your answer is going to be to that. And but then also, how if it's not going to be certifiable, then how else could companies demonstrate or measure the social impact and how they are taking a best practice approach to protecting psychological health?
Okay, so two parts to the question. So I'll answer the first part first in terms of the certifiable. So bear with me, listeners, as I try and explain the quirky world of international standards. So there are rules and frameworks that are associated with international standards, and Sheila mentioned that 45,001 is a parent, and that's how I describe it. So there are kind of like the core standards, and they're called requirement standards, and those core standards are the standards that are then available to be offered as accredited certification. Now, accredited means that certification bodies like BSI and others have to demonstrate basically a very rigorous quality management system to the processes that we use for coming in and doing those third-party audits to say that your organization is meeting those standards. So it's a very rigorous and a robust process. And as I say, that is only available for these, what I call parent standards. And then underneath those parent standards, there are a range of different sort of sibling, cousins, second cousins standards of all of different types. And 45003 is a sibling standard. So it's a guideline standard. So it doesn't have this a special requirement status, and therefore it can't be accredited, offered as accredited certification. So a weird quirk. Hope that kind of makes sense to people, but that's kind of the rules and the process. However, BSI are offering an unaccredited certification to it, and what that means, we are following all of those rules that we have to normally for accredited. So in terms of the robustness and the integrity of the process for the certification, we're following exactly the same. What it means for the client organization is when they get their certificate at the end, for an accredited certification, the badge of the accredited organization is on the certificate. So if we're talking in the UK, that's pretty much UCAS. In other parts of the world, it might be ANAB or local accreditation bodies. So that's the kind of the demonstration of that accreditation process, is you get the logo on your certificate. For the BSI certification, as I say, we are following all of the same rules, the same level of rigor, and all it means is the certificate that you get at the end just doesn't have that logo, that accreditation logo on it. So I think there are mechanisms for organisations to be able to demonstrate that third party assessment and independent verification that they're implementing the standard, as say BSI are doing that.
Yeah, well, first of all, that's the first part of the question answered, and that's a really good answer, by the way. Really great plug for BSI, I should say as well, which is fantastic. But I think, companies, they often put themselves up for awards and everything to demonstrate, what they're doing around mentally healthy workplaces. I think this is far more credible in that, it's not a competition, but anyone can. There's not a limited amount of spaces, right? Like anyone can achieve this level of certification. Like you say, it's not accredited certification. Yeah. Or what do you call it? Unaccredited.
Unaccredited, yeah. So we have an unaccredited. But I mean, I think Jason, it's worth making the point. There is interest in having that certification for some of the reasons you said. But I think it's really important to make the point that all of these standards are voluntary. There are one or two places in the world where, and actually Australia is a good example, where some forms of standards are written into parts of legislation. But generally speaking, they are entirely voluntary, and they're a tool. So you can use some of it, all of it, bits of it, not bits of it. So certification is, whether it's accredited or unaccredited, is optional, it's voluntary, and it depends on what you're looking for as a business. But to come back to your other point, Jason, what you're touching on there in terms of measuring and demonstrating it, again, part of the standard requires you to set objectives that are smart and measurable, and then if you're setting those objectives, if you're setting your goals, then you have something that you can report on, and a lot of organizations are starting to report on these things in annual reports. We're seeing it growing again. Sort of the ESG agenda that we talked about is driving that need to report. But you can measure the benefits of using this tool, even without the need for the certification. If you're identifying where you are now and you're setting your goals for where you want to be, then you can measure that, and you can report internally, or you can report externally, or you can do a combination of both. So there are different ways of demonstrating how well you're doing this. And awards have some merit. I think the other thing that we're seeing, as this is kind of a UK based one associated with legislation, actually, is there's the Social Value Act. I don't know whether you've come across this, has been introduced as part of the kind of procurement for government services. And that Social Value Act asks for those procurement organisations my voice is going, to demonstrate how they are supporting social value within their organisation and the wider community. And it's clear from talking to our clients, particularly those in construction, that having and using and implementing 45,003 is a very good way of demonstrating that social value, that social conscience.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I believe there's an equivalent in New Zealand, but not in Australia yet. But hopefully we get something like that in place. Yeah, for sure.
I'm just thinking, my background is supply chain. So I spent 30 years working in supply chain. And for me, I see that, especially places like construction where big tenders are being given out, the Social Values Act with public sector, the supply chain has such potential to make an impact in terms of getting these standards adopted. Because if it comes to the point that you don't get the contract because you're not investing in your people, that's really powerful, isn't it?
Hugely, yeah, hugely. And I think, we see that particularly in construction. I think because historically it's not been very good at looking after its people, and certainly again talking to construction organizations, they're already saying that they expect to see this push down the supply chain. But you're right, and it comes back to the point we made earlier when we were talking about things like content moderation. It's not acceptable just to give the stuff that you don't like and is a bit difficult to somebody else. You've got to take responsibility throughout that supply chain. And again, the benefit for the organization, yes, is reputational, which is really significant, especially in the age of social media now, where poor practices are suddenly global issues because of Twitter or Facebook or WeChat or whatever it happens to be. But again, the benefits are wider than that. It comes back to some of the quality points that I was making. If the whole of your supply chain is looking after its people, all of the benefits that we started on at the beginning of this podcast happen throughout that supply chain. So all of that is going to do is make your service, maybe as the end product, end client, better.
Yeah, I mean, we can talk it till the cows come home, but it's one short sentence, isn't it? Good people is good for looking after your people is good for business.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's that simple. Jason, do you have any final questions for Kate before I ask her the final question? Pete would be really proud of me right now, looking at the time.
Look, like I said before, if Pete's the worst timekeeper, hopefully he listens to he's horrible at staying on track, but it's he knows that already. No, Kate, it's been fantastic chatting with you. Really great to see the perspective of BSI on the standard. Sheila and I obviously agree with you. It's a very exciting standard. We're really excited to see companies adopt this. And I learned something new that you can get through BSI, unaccredited certification, which I think will actually be a draw card for many organisations.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, Kate, just one. I always end our kind of podcast sessions just asking for one take-home piece of advice. If they take one thing if business leaders take one thing from our chat today, I think I know what you're going to say. But what would that?
Oh no! I feel the pressure. I'm like, which bit do I use?
Yeah, that'd be only kind of that food for thought that they need to have front of mind.
So I think for business leaders, I mean, it comes back to the point that you made, that looking after your people is good for organisations. But I'd just come back to the findings from our organisational resilience survey. Leaders are focused on how do they make their organisation the most resilient? How do they actually create the right conditions to weather disruption like the pandemic and then come out of it stronger the other side? And the answer to that question is looking after your people.
Fantastic. And just to echo what Jason said, it's been really, really interesting talking to you today and finding out more about the standing, especially around the certification and accreditation, because I still think there's a little bit of confusion still with people that are just getting familiar with this as to how that works. So it's fantastic that BSI are offering that accreditation. And thank you for your time today.
Lovely. Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you.